Hello and welcome to the Horti-Culturalists. I'm Stephen Ryan.
And I am Matthew Lucas, walking through your orchard. Stephen, we're out of lockdown.
Yes, we're back together again.
Oh, and here we are. Now, you and Craig did shoot the footage, which is going to be today's story.
Yes.
What did you decide to cover, Mr. Ryan?
We covered one of the world's great flowering plants, and that's the tree peony.
Now I love tree peonies, and I actually do want to have one in our front garden whenever we finally get to move in.
Yep.
So let us go to your tree peonies,
All right.
and then we can look at the footage that you created. And I've got some questions for you.
All right, good idea.
Let's go. Stephen, behold the tree peony. Oh, I have to smell it. Do they ever have fragrance?
Yes, some of them are.
Oh, that's actually quite beautiful.
Yes, so it does depend on which species you get or which form you get as to whether you get perfume or not. And this particular one is one of the creme de la creme of the tree peonies.
As Maggie Smith would have said.
Yeah, this is a double flowered form of what is generally known as peony rockii, which was discovered by Mr. Rock in China many years ago, was brought into the Western world and created a furore.
I can imagine, because it's the most extraordinary flower. Well, let us go and look at your footage that was shot by Craig. Thank you, Craig. And then I'm going to come back and ask you a few questions.
What a good idea. Now today we're off to China and we're going to look at the genus of Peony. Now there's a fair few things I'd like to say about this genus before we actually get into the nitty-gritty of how to grow them and look after them. First thing is there are two main types of peonies. There are the herbaceous peonies, so those that die down below ground level every year, and they extend right through into Europe. And then there are the tree peonies, which tend to be only Asian. Now in Australia, and this may happen in other parts of the world, you often hear people talking about peony roses. Now I'm going to try and stop you saying that. They're not roses, they're not related to roses, and putting rose on the end of the name is completely and utterly superfluous. If you want to be more specific about your peonies, then you can certainly say herbaceous peony or tree peony. And there's also an intersectional group known as the Itohs, which are in fact hybrids between both. But we may not go into that today, because it's about the tree peonies I want to talk. Now the name peony comes from ancient Greek for the plant, and it is thought to actually commemorate Paeon, who was apparently the physician of the gods. One does have to wonder why the gods need physicians, but there you go. And they are probably one of the queens of the flowering world. Now, if I've got you as excited about growing tree peonies as I am, we probably need to define a couple more things. First is tree peonies aren't trees. They're shrubs, but they have a woody base, so therefore they have a tree-like structure, and that's what defines them as opposed to the herbaceous peonies. They rarely grow more than a couple of meters tall, and some of them will stay even much lower than that. Now, if you want to grow them, you need to have a Mediterranean to cold climate. They are not for the tropics, so if you happen to live in the tropical countries, I'm sorry, because you won't be able to grow peonies. The tree peonies, however, don't need a winter chill like the herbaceous peonies do. So they can be grown in coastal gardens around Victoria and other areas around the coast, perhaps into Adelaide and around into Perth, whereas the herbaceous peonies probably won't flower properly for you. Now, selecting a site for tree peonies is quite important. I often say to people, if you could grow good cabbages, you could grow good tree peonies. And the reason I mean that is that they like similar sorts of conditions. They like an aspect that's nice and sunny. That's really important. They need to get sun for probably at least half of the day. They don't like root competition from big trees and shrubs nearby. And they need a good, rich, friable, well-drained soil. So even an old vegetable garden where you've decided to give up growing veggies might in fact be the perfect place to grow your tree peonies.
Stephen, and it was such a glorious day, and let's just say our first day of freedom together, it's less than sunny, but never mind.
Yeah, well, we'll survive.
Which brings me to the question of full sun. Now, you did allude to that, but is there any room to wiggle with tree peonies in terms of their need for light?
All right, when it comes to light sources, they need direct sunlight on them for at least half the day.
Yep.
And if you can give them more than that, all the better.
Yep.
I always allude to people, if they're going to try and grow tree peonies, try and treat them like good vegetables.
Yes, you made that point about veggie patches. And when I was in China, actually, the beds that are created to grow tree peonies are really exposed. There's no sort of nicety about it. It's there, it's in full sun, and it's all about the tree peony. There's no underplanting. It's just bare soil and the plants, which only bloom for whatever,
You
3 weeks a year.
Yeah, you probably get 3 weeks out of the average peony. Having said that, of course, some species and forms of tree peonies will flower earlier than others. So if you've got a selection, you will have a staggering of flowers. I mean, my first tree peony came out early spring here, mid-September, and they're still going on now. So, you know, it's not too bad.
Then the other point is they are deciduous. So does the foliage sometimes do something? Can it have glorious colour? Can that be a thing or not?
Marginally. Some tree...
That's a no.
Yeah, well, maybe. But I have seen tree peonies colour reasonably well towards autumn. Yeah. It's not something I've studied particularly to see which ones do it better or whether it's different seasons that they do it better in. But yeah, you can get a little bit of autumnal colour, and the foliage during the summer is not unattractive. It's a pleasant leaf, so you know, so they have something going on. But they are about the spring, really.
They are.
Now, this single one is a species tree peony from China, and it's Peony Osteoi. Now, all of the wild species peonies, of course, are single. The doubles have been developed in cultivation over the centuries. And it's interesting that quite a number of peonies came into Western cultivation back in the time when China first opened up and were grown as species, only to be found that they were actually cultivars years later. So there's quite some confusion when it comes to peonies' names. The single ones are often quite fertile and will produce seed. Now, seed is one of these things that we need to talk about when it comes to peonies. They'll form their seed by late summer, early autumn. When the pods split open, you'll have these quite large black seeds inside. You can raise tree peonies from seed. They're likely to cross-pollinate, so you can't always be sure that they're going to be true to form. And they won't come up the first spring. They will stay dormant right through until the following spring and come up, although they will produce a root in the first spring. So you have to be very patient, and they normally take between 3 and 8 years to start flowering from seed. So you need to start young if you're going to grow tree peonies from seed. The other way that they're normally propagated is by layering. So you can pin branches down into the ground, nick the base of the stem, and leave it there for at least 2 to 3 years, and it will produce a root system of its own, and then you can separate it from the parent plant and move it on into another part of the garden. Of course, you'll end up with another peony of exactly the same variety, so, you know, maybe it's not worth it, maybe you go out and buy another one, but remember, they're not cheap. Now, another thing that's a bit contentious is what sort of pH peonies need. Now, my soil here is naturally around about 6 on the pH scale, so it's slightly acidic. I have never limed my peonies and it doesn't seem to have made any difference. Some people swear by putting garden lime around them, and they certainly don't seem to mind it. But if your soil's already alkaline, this is probably unnecessary. If you've got a sick peony, well, maybe you might look at putting a little bit of lime around that. That might just perk it up. The other thing you've got to consider is when you buy a young tree peony, it'll probably come to you in perhaps a 20 centimetre or 8-inch pot. The plant will have been grown in that pot hopefully for a wee while, so it will have a nice developed root system, and you can probably plant it in the ground if it's well prepared, probably straight away. What you need to do then is be patient. Peonies tend to sulk in the first year, they tend to settle in the second year, and then they tend to get underway in the third year. So it's sort of a 3-year process to get a peony really flourishing. And this nice large plant of peony black panther that I've got here has been in the ground for probably 4 or 5 years now. And it's got something like 10 or a dozen blooms on it for this year, and it has been flowering the last year or so. Now, finally, the other thing that keeps people wondering with peonies is the pruning of your tree peonies. Now, obviously you take out any dead wood, so if there's any dead pieces through your tree peony, remove those and you can take them out at any time of the year. Now, when the peony is finished flowering, it's going to want to try and produce seed, particularly if it's a single variety. So unless you're wanting to grow it for seed, you're better to prune the flower heads out so that all the strength goes back into the plant. Now, where do you prune to? And what you need to do is go down the stem and look in the axils of the leaves. And you'll go down until you find an axil where in fact there is a growth bud. So in the case of this one here, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the 5th leaf down has a nice active bud in it. And you prune to there because all these other leaves are in fact blind. I have a bit of a soft spot for dark red peonies. There's something seriously sumptuous about them. This particular one is one called Thunderbolt, and it rarely grows up even as high as knee high. And you get these more or less single or semi-double brilliant red flowers with the dark eye in the centre. Another issue with some tree peonies is that their flowers are too heavy for their stems, and so they have no real garden merit. So this is where staking them could come in handy. I use bamboo canes that I've cut from my own garden. I use a sisal twine because it rots away and can go in the compost when it's finished with, because it's only going to have to stake them up for a very short time. And the trick is to try and push the stakes into the ground where they're as inconspicuous as possible. You then pull the flower up to where the stake is and cut the stake just below the flower head, like so. And you get yourself a piece of sisal twine and you gently tie into place so that you don't really see where the stake is. And that way you get to enjoy the flower without having it hanging over. All right, so here we have a bud that I'll do the same to. So bring it up so that you can see where the top of the stake should be. Cut the stake off, and then you just get your little piece of sisal twine and tie it in behind the flower bud. You should really do this before they open up fully, but sometimes I run out of time. And there we go, it's now sitting up nicely so that when it opens up, you'll see this beautiful flower, but you won't see much of the stake, and hopefully you won't see any of the twine, and it will look quite natural in the garden.
The other thing that I was really interested by was your pruning technique. So thank you for pointing that out. But do you have to prune a tree peony to shape it, or is it simply about stopping the seed heads forming?
Well, it's about stopping the seed heads forming, but it's also about taking the flowers off back to where there's a live bud, because it's 2 or 3 buds or more down the stem behind the leaves. And if you don't take it off, when the tree peony tries to set seed, and not all of them will, but they can, once that's all done, that piece of stem is going to die anyway, and you need to remove it so that you're not leaving dead wood in your peony. So yeah, so it's an important thing to do. I generally don't recommend people try and collect seed. I mean, it's a slow process.
Hands up, I did.
Yeah, well, you know,
we have a mutual friend who has amazing yellow, I think double or single, I can't remember.
Double ones, I think, from memory.
I did, but you know, you said in your piece about it takes 2 cycles. I didn't have the patience. I didn't realise. Maybe they're all germinating on the compost heap.
Yeah, well, that's something that happens regularly, I think, because, yes, generally speaking, even fresh peony seed, it will put its root down in the first year, but you won't see any evidence of it having germinated. And then in the following season, it will send up its first leaves. Now, I have had them germinate in the first year, but it's not regular. It doesn't happen very often.
There we go. Okay, Tree Peony 101. Now, you also mentioned the Itoh peony, which is that crazy mega mix hybrid between the tree peony and herbaceous, which I've always been not confused, struggling with Itoh peonies. But can we go and have a look at yours? And I want to ask you some questions about that.
Why don't we?
Lead on, McDuff.
I shall.
All right, Itoh peonies. God, we have to crouch through the undergrowth. So firstly, the name. It sounds curious.
Yes, well, it's named after the first person who managed to cross a tree peony with a herbaceous peony.
Aha, Mr. Itoh.
Well, in fact, Dr.
Dr. Itoh, no less.
After the Second World War, with the aftermath of the war, he became completely and utterly entranced with the idea of producing this intersectional hybrid. It had always been a holy grail. And so he started crossing. And eventually, in 1945, I think it was. No, it wasn't. It was 1948. He actually produced his first crosses. Unfortunately, he died in 1956, having not seen any of his plants actually flower.
Oh, this is a sad story.
It is a sad story, but his family took over the plants. Some of them eventually went to some American people who then worked on them. And eventually they are now well entrenched in horticulture.
They are, and I'm curious as to, surely the herbaceous and the tree peonies are 2 very different species.
Well, they are. They're genetically quite different from each other. So actually getting across between them, the problem was, in fact, that it was really hard to do. So once the break had been done, though, you then have this intersectional group that can in fact then be bred and bred and bred. So there's been lots of different Itohs produced since that time.
And can the Itohs then be crossed back with herbaceous and tree peonies?
Quite probably that's what will happen, and in fact some Itohs will have characteristics that are more like those of the tree peonies.
Yeah.
Some will have characteristics that are more like those of the herbaceous peonies.
Yeah.
So some of them will have little nubs of woodiness at ground level, which would show that they've got that tree peony sort of connection. But one of the good things about the Itohs for the Australian market particularly is that they don't need the winter chill that the herbaceous peonies need.
Yes.
So
which limits the range in Australia to high altitude cold places, really.
Yeah, well, exactly.
Like here.
Like Tasmania, like the northeast of Victoria, all those places where you can grow really good herbaceous peonies.
Yeah.
The Itohs should grow and flower quite well in the right aspect in a garden and with the right soil types for people in much less likely sort of environments.
Yes, which would include a lot of Europe and a lot of the States, which perhaps aren't that cold but still want to grow peonies. All right, let's have a look at your Itoh.
Yes, I've got one in flower just down here.
Aha! And here we have your Itoh. It's beautiful.
They are stunningly beautiful plants.
And first thing that strikes me is obviously the flowers look basically the same as a herbaceous slash tree peony.
Yes, there's not that much difference in the flowers, other than the fact that unlike many of the tree peonies and some of the herbaceous peonies, the Itohs tend to have quite strong stems and their flowers sit up nicely, so there's very rarely any need to sort of do any remedial staking and things with these plants.
Yes.
And of course they make fantastic cut flowers.
Do tree peonies cut well?
Yeah, they'll cut all right. They're not long lived in a vase, and you can only go back to where the first bud is on the stem, so you can't really
More
get
of a posy.
Yeah, more of a posy, yes. You can't get really long stems on a tree peony unless you have an impact on the plant itself, which I wouldn't do.
No.
But these, of course, you can cut them with quite long stems.
Yeah. Now, it's quite a tidy plant. It's not that big, so kind of good for your average smallish garden.
Yeah,
So am
definitely.
I right in thinking it is a completely herbaceous perennial? It's going to die down completely and leave no woody bits like a tree peony would?
Well, with Itohs, that's not quite true because it depends on which parent they sort of tend to take
Favour,
after.
yes.
Most of them are like a herbaceous peony and they'll die down, but some of them will have woody, nubby pieces of stem at the bottom, which will stay there through the winter, and they will actually shoot from that. But most of the biomass you can see here will disappear in the winter.
Right, right, right. And like the other peonies, similar conditions, full sun, no competition.
Yeah, veggie garden type conditions. So full sun, good rich soil.
Yes.
Most peonies are quite greedy, so if there's plenty of food around, they'll use it.
Like the best of us.
Yeah, but once they're well established, they're pretty bulletproof actually. They're a very easy group of plants to keep.
Now on that point, given our climate, given the Australian summer, how drought tolerant are they? Now, I've seen them grow, not Itohs, but I've seen tree peonies and herbaceous peonies growing in China, in Chinese gardens, and quite dry in summer. What about the Itoh?
Yep, the Itohs are fairly drought tolerant once they get their big carroty roots well down into the ground.
So, $1 million question. Yes, of course, the roots. So, herbaceous are tuberous, a tree peony, a tree peony is not, it's just rooty.
Yeah, yes, I love your technical terminology, yes.
So what's the Itoh, a combination of two?
Yeah, well, it tends to have sort of tubery looking roots. I mean, even the tree peonies get big fat fleshy roots. I mean, none of them have fine rooty sort of structures under them. So they have all get quite big fat roots which are quite water holding.
Yes.
And although a peony might actually get a bit frazzled by late summer if we get some really hot weather, it'll have done all its growing, it'll have done all its feeding. So if by late summer the plant's looking a bit scruffy, it won't matter. It'll be back again next year flowering its head off.
There you go, Itoh peonies. Well, thank you, Dr. Itoh. Thank you, Dr. Ryan. Are you a doctor?
No, I am not a doctor. No, no. I'm a charlatan.
A quack.
Yes.
All right, onwards and upwards.
Fantastic.
Mr. Ryan.
Peonies have been done.
Peonies have been done. I love peonies since childhood. I've always loved them. And I have to say, I've always been a bit shy of Itohs. I've always just thought they were a bit weird. And, you know, like a zebra and a donkey, you know. It's just,
well, it is a bit. It is a bit that way, but they have. We now have a really interesting group of garden plants that will be I think the peonies are the future, personally.
Well, they're so useful. I mean, they cover so many bases in terms of different climates and garden types and sizes. So I am now an Itoh convert. Thank you. And thank you, Craig, for all your film work before, the other footage of your tree peonies on the glorious Macedon day. I also noticed that we're actually by one of your little bird bath pond features, which we did a story about. In fact, you did a story about.
Yes, that's right. So you could go back and have a look.
We will.
Yes.
Okay, now that we're back, what are we going to do next?
Oh, goodness knows.
The world is our oyster and the garden is your oyster.
Yep, and we will be back next week with something titillating, I'm sure.
We will, but in the meantime, do subscribe. We post every week and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Bye all.